I realize that gospel reading and the ending of it must be shocking, especially on a day where we're baptizing a baby with parents and grandparents and all sorts of relatives present. And I'd rather talk about Romans, and I will come around to what Jesus said and explain it in context in a bit. It's a wonderful coincidence for me that we're reading a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans that speaks of baptism on a day when a family comes to have a child baptized. The book of Romans is a beautiful poetic letter in which Paul does some of his most sophisticated thinking pretty soon before his own death by execution about what he thinks is going on in terms of our relationship to Jesus and our relationship to God through Jesus. And he sets up this powerful series of contrasts between law and Jesus, the law of Moses and Jesus, between sin and grace, which we hear about today, between death and life. And he's addressing an audience that is divided, Jews and Gentiles, both of whom are following Jesus in the church in Rome, which is the region of Rome, already a fast-growing church. But some of them were people who had originally been Jewish, what we would say are Jewish, and people who had never been Jewish, but Gentiles who had come to know Jesus through all the missions going on among the Gentiles. So some of the Jews thought they were better than the Gentiles because they were authentic. They were just like Jesus. They were Jewish. They followed all the laws of Moses. And so they thought they were better than the Gentiles, who were not circumcised and who didn't have part of the long covenant with God. And the Gentiles thought they were better than the Jews, and some of them, rather, because they didn't follow all that rigmarole, all the laws and numbers in Deuteronomy and the Bible. They just ignore all that because they're saved because they've been baptized, so they don't need to pay attention to any of that. And Paul was basically speaking to both of them, saying, you are so wonderful because of this, but knock it off. You are so wonderful because of this, but knock it off. That's what's going on in the book of Romans. That's the audience, and what he's trying to explain to them is the intricate relationship between sin and grace and how we should position ourselves in terms of sin and grace. In our time, I would say that you don't find the division so much between Jews and Gentiles in terms of how we look at what Paul's talking about. You would see in our time more of a division between evangelicals and what I would call the more progressive Christians, and we in the Episcopal Church are sometimes labeled that. And I got a good flavor of that when I was in Puerto Vallarta last week. I went with a friend of mine who is an evangelical Christian, and we talk about Christianity a lot around the edges. I should say around the core, and don't get around the edges too much. But as we were talking about what we were going to do in Puerto Vallarta, she said, on Sunday, do you want to go to the English language service at Calvary Chapel with me? And I thought, I said, all right, fine. Now, if you don't know, Calvary Chapel is one of the more conservative evangelical congregations. I've never attended one, but I thought this was my opportunity to broaden my horizons. And so when we went there, the preacher came up and introduced himself to us before the service, and he said, did we walk with Jesus? I said, I hope so. I'm an Episcopal priest. And he said, I went to an Episcopal church when I was young, and then, I rebelled. And then he said, and then I was saved. And of course, in my head, I was thinking, well, I was saved. Okay, never mind. So I'm not even going to get into that with him. And then he preached on a passage of Revelation in which he's talking about the end of the world, and he was taking it quite literally. He's very worried, this preacher, about the mark of the beast, that is the devil, demon, Satan. And you're going to hear that word, Satan, in our baptism today. And the mark of Christ, which Asher is going to receive today. I'm going to say, you are sealed by the Holy Spirit and marked as Christ's own forever. And he was very worried about it. He was fearful about it. He was anxious for the people in the church not to send children to public schools because there's evil in public schools. And I thought, how different from my way of approaching the world. I think there is evil in the world and there are things to fear in the world, but I don't actually fear the prowling evil that's going to come get me, because I think of myself as protected by God. Maybe not from all evil, but protected ultimately. As Jesus says, we don't have to worry about any damage that happens to the body, only damage that happens to the soul. But nevertheless, this preacher was very concerned about people being protected and saving their souls. And he has a fear of God. Now, I would say that that is one of the big division lines between evangelicals and progressives, that we don't talk very much about sin, we don't talk about hell over on our side, we don't talk about fearing God, and you hear a lot of that on the more evangelical side. You should straighten up, get baptized, go to church every Sunday, read the Bible, so that God will save you. I think that Paul would appreciate, if he were writing in our time, he would write a letter to the evangelicals and Christians, and he'd say, this is wonderful about you, and knock it off, and this is wonderful about you, and knock it off. Jesus says, don't fear what they can do to the body, only fear the one who can take away the life of the body and the soul. So in other words, Jesus seems to say, you should be afraid of God. And then almost one sentence later, he says, do not be afraid, for your Father is going to count every hair of your head. Do you see how it can be a little bit confusing? What kind of God do we have? What kind of God are we related to? And I think what Jesus means is this. Don't get complacent. If you know that you are one of God's beloved, and I believe all people are one of God's beloved, then don't get complacent in your relationship with God. Don't think you can do whatever you want because you have grace, because you're saved. And that's why that passage in chapter 6 says, so, now that we know that we have grace, does that mean we can do whatever we want? Shall we sin? By no means. Grace abounds. But grace does not abound if you choose to turn deliberately away from it and say, well, I'm saved, so I can do whatever I want because I lie in the arms of God. On the other hand, to live in fear of God puts one in the threat of the person with no talents, if you remember the parable of talents in the book of Matthew. When the only person who gets in trouble with the master in the book of talents is the person who said, I heard that you were a hard taskmaster and I was afraid, so I did nothing. Remember? So living in fear of God also doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't get you in a relationship with God. You're going to be running away from God. So instead, it is finding a balance in which we rest and trust without fear in our relationship with God and the grace that has wiped out the sin of the world. It says it at least twice in Romans, in 5 and 6. It says Jesus died to save everyone. Those are the words, everyone or all. And at the same time, we are not to take that as a license to then run amok in the world. Does that make sense? So I'll give you an illustration of this from Puerto Vallarta. So on one of the nights, the resort I was staying at with my friend was having a Mexican fiesta. And the restaurants at that resort weren't so great, so I wasn't too thrilled about the idea. But we did it. We paid the cover charge, and we went in, and we were seated alongside one of the big pools with a little waterfall in it. It was very lovely. And they had, a massive buffet of every kind of roasted and grilled meat with all kinds of lovely salsas, and over here salads and fruits and beans, and it was gorgeous. And then, a large table of desserts, including gluten-free ones. I was in trouble. And we sit down, and they said the entertainment will begin soon. So I got more than a plate's worth of food because I was just going, look at all this, look at all I can get. I can have everything I want. And then they said, would you like anything to drink? And my friend said, Miss Evangelical, my evangelical friend said, I'll have a margarita. I said, I'll take a margarita too. Now, normally, for those of you who are not yet of drinking age, a margarita is about that much of a mixture of alcohol and sweet things. And I got that much because they gave me a big plastic tumbler full. And it was clearly so that they wouldn't have to keep coming back and giving people repeat drinks. But it was way too much for me, way too much. And I knew that. I knew it was too much for me. But still, you think, hey. So then the entertainment started. So I'm already gorging myself on a plate full of food and sipping slowly this margarita. And the mariachis start. Now, does everybody know what mariachis look and sound like? So you get a picture in your head of what mariachis, okay, good. And I've heard lots of mariachis. my life in California, but these were very, very, very good. There was a harp, un arpa, and a violinist, and guitarists, and trompetas, and singers. And every time, oops, I forgot about this. Every time it sounded like the music was going to stop, they kind of go, the trumpets would go, dun, 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 and like that sounds like the end. So I'd start to, and then they'd go, and I think, okay, that's the end. And, like it never stopped. It just kept going, and I thought, wow, this is one of the best mariachis I've ever heard, and it never stops. It was so good that I didn't go back for like the third helping of the grilled this and the sauteed that and the da-da-da-da-da. I didn't drink all the drink because I was so interested in it. And then if that wasn't enough, then out came the dancers. They had dancers from 3 different regions, 3 different states of Mexico. So perhaps you've seen the dancers as well. The women come out in the bright dresses with many flounces and layers of skirts, and they lift them up like this. And then you think, oh, but no, then the men come out, the ballerines. And the men started dancing. And I thought, this is fantastic. It drew my attention away from what I'm just going to say are the evils of gorging oneself and drinking way too much, because neither of those things are good for you, right? Away from the multiple desserts I could have had. Instead, paying attention to this wonderful concert. And this is what the world is like. Kudos to the evangelical preacher who said, the mark of the beast is out there. There's evil in the world. Eating way too much, drinking way too much was to me like a symbol of the way the world keeps wanting you to do the thing you actually know you don't really want to do anyway. And yet, the grace of God is so beautiful and it abounds. It's always there. And just when you think God couldn't be more graceful than God is, you get even more and more like, oh, it keeps going. It keeps going. It keeps going. The grace of God is just layer after layer that you can't believe you're receiving. Now, maybe you're not at a time in your life when you need to hear this, but there are lots of times when people need to hear this. When people are sitting in prison, they need to hear this. When people are despised and hated because of their orientation or their race or their age or their attitudes, they need to hear this. When your relationship has fallen apart, you need to hear this. What God wants is us to sing and dance in our lives in appreciation, using all our gifts and all our energy. To not think of being saved as one moment when our head gets a little wet, but a moment after moment of transformation as we grow more and more like the teacher. Amen.